VIP prisoners arrive at camp. Since the middle of 1943, captured German generals have been held at the English country estate of Trent Park near London. They still talk about the war and the Wehrmacht, even though the front line seems very distant in these comfortable surroundings. Stripped of their power among friends, the generals express themselves freely. They have no idea that their conversations are being secretly recorded, providing a unique record of what they were really thinking at the time.
It's time to make peace. What are we still fighting for?
I can answer that. The party. They can't make peace because they know only too well that they will be hanged.
That's right. Nobody wants to discuss peace with them.
Even if our government resigns, it still wouldn't be over. Then the Allies will come to us to negotiate, because they can't get any further.
I don't think we're going to agree about that.
Either we die, or they fall apart. The Americans don't know what they're fighting for anymore. And when they suffer too many casualties, they will ask, what in hell are we doing here?
No. It will be all over by spring. They break through by spring at the latest. And then it's all over.
Come along, Herr Wildermuth. After all, at the end of the day, we are still German officers.
What does it take to be a good German soldier? Does your honor force you to hold out in a hopeless situation? Every frontline soldier, whatever his rank, his character, or his posting, will struggle with this question in the final year of the war. The answers will be as varied as the men themselves. Commanders, like Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, who pushes his men in every way to give their all. Ordinary soldiers like Private Kurt Vetter, only a bullet can save his life. Or a senior officer like Gerhard Graf von Schwerin, torn as the war progresses between his duty to obey and his common sense. The 45-year-old Lieutenant General is known to be willful, but he doesn't usually question orders.
I had the impression that he was a loyal officer and general who carried out his orders, even if he sometimes complained and maybe now and then raised objections against them when he felt they were not justified.
In mid-1944, under the overall command of Field Marshal Walter Model, Schwerin leads his panzers into battle against the advancing Allies in the west. His division is always sent where the action is hottest, to put out the flames. But through that summer, crushing Allied superiority forces them back, closer and closer to the German frontier. With this in mind, Schwerin unveils a new plan to his officers at his temporary headquarters at a medieval Belgian manor near Aachen. Or at least that's the story he tells after the war.
I certainly intended to do everything in my power to end the war, which had become hopeless. So I would try to keep the old imperial city of Aachen out of the combat zone.
You could say that he was very willful. He had strong opinions, and he stood up for them. You can see that in Aachen. He was ready to hand over the city without a fight, against the Führer's direct orders.
For this border town, steeped in history, is to be held as a fortress at any cost. Hitler has given strict orders.
If the enemy should enter Aachen, every house will be defended. There will be no retreat.
When they reach Aachen, the Wehrmacht are greeted by chaos. City and Nazi Party officials have long since left the city, after issuing a vague order to evacuate.
When I entered Aachen, I saw to my horror that the whole population was on the move, with children and carts piled high with possessions. Everyone was crying and upset. They'd been told everyone must leave immediately.
That must have shocked him greatly. And then he called his officers together, and he ordered them to drive into the city, to calm the population, and to tell them to go back home.
In the meantime, Schwerin makes arrangements for the peaceful surrender of Aachen. Apart from a few advanced guards, he keeps his division outside the city. He wants to avoid pointless street fighting. Looking for a way to communicate with the enemy, he goes to the city's telegraph office. Here he dares to break a military taboo. He leaves a message for the Americans, whose arrival he expects imminently. He writes in English.
I stop the stupid evacuation of civil population and ask you to give her relief. I'm the last commanding officer here, Gerhard Graf von Schwerin.
Has this Wehrmacht officer distinguished himself with this act from the ranks of obedient servants of the regime? To become the savior of Aachen, as he likes to be called after the war.
Aachen has thanked me in a very special way for my attempts to save the city from destruction.
But he failed. Schwerin's plan did not work. For US forces do not enter Aachen. After a grueling chase, they've stopped to catch their breath. The protector of the city now has a serious problem. His deliberate defiance of an order will be exposed.
When Schwerin realizes on the morning of the 13th that the Americans aren't coming, he immediately reverses his decision and sends his troops straight into the city, to the very same streets he'd wanted to save from combat that morning.
Aachen does become a battleground, with everything that means for the inhabitants. In order to maintain discipline in the fortress city, the division now sets up a summary court-martial. It sentences 2 suspected looters to death. They had been caught on the streets. They're only 14 years old.
It got around like wildfire. They're shooting kids over there. Of course, I wondered what was happening. And then all of a sudden they were dragging the kids out of the house. I was very, very shocked because I knew both of the boys. I just couldn't take it in. They'd blindfolded the boys with big men's handkerchiefs. And Karl kept yelling, "Mama, Mama, Mama, I don't want to die. I didn't do anything. Mama, I don't want to die." And then suddenly someone yelled, "Fire!" and they started shooting. And Karl Schwarz fell down, but he picked himself back up and started walking off towards Feldmannplatz, just taking a step at a time. And a young lieutenant ran after him and said, "What? You don't want to die?" and finished him off.
On the authority of an order issued by Schwerin from his headquarters.
Looters will be subject to summary execution by the Wehrmacht.
Later, he would attempt to justify this directive.
I was in charge in Aachen, and I said to myself, if people start looting here, that will have to be stopped at all costs. It is, of course, deplorable that 2 14-year-olds were shot. If I'd known of it, I would definitely have said, stop.
The day after the event, things looked a bit different in Schwerin's report to his superiors.
I ordered looters to be tried. 2 looters were executed. Signed, Schwerin.
What happened here is that by using this extreme force, by killing children, the Wehrmacht sent a very clear message to the people of Aachen that they were in control again. These executions were meant to get the people off the streets and give the Wehrmacht a free hand to act. And that, of course, was in very sharp contrast to what Schwerin had supposedly planned that morning, namely to save Aachen and its inhabitants.
Now Schwerin's priority is to save his own skin. His letter to the enemy could be a death sentence. He tries to get it back, but it's too late. Party officials have long been informed. Schwerin's superior, Field Marshal Model, opens proceedings against his insubordinate divisional commander for high treason. But Schwerin has influential supporters. Instead of being punished, he's transferred to the Italian front, and later even promoted to full general. Schwerin was Aachen's Hamlet. He wanted to save the city, but he wasn't prepared to face the consequences.
He wavered between allegiance to his country, to the Führer's orders, and common sense. And of course, the soldiers in Aachen had to pay the price.
Schwerin's original plan had failed miserably. Aachen was the first German city to become a battlefield, and then a field of rubble. Obeying orders, Schwerin's successor Gerhard Wilk let the destruction continue until the bitter end. Later he too tried to justify his actions.
Of course I could have stopped earlier, maybe, to prevent this senseless bloodshed. But that would have been it. I would have been sentenced to death for breach of duty. I constantly faced an inner struggle between obedience, duty, and honor.
But these insights only occur to the colonel after his capture, from the perspective of a British prisoner of war camp.
The fighting in Aachen became utterly pointless, but retreat was turned down flat. Hold out, they said, to complete the slogan, until your last cartridge. In fact, we did hold out for 4 or 5 days, and then it was all over. However, the civilians behaved like swine. Wherever German soldiers were holding their positions or were hiding, civilians rushed out to tell the Americans where they were.
Really? But why, Wilk?
To bring things to an end.
By the fall of 1944, the Allies have reached the borders of Germany, both in the east and the west. Now the Wehrmacht has to hold out at any price. In Kurland in the Baltics, for instance, an entire German army is cut off. By October, forced back by vastly superior Soviet armies, the only place left to go is Svalbard, a 200 square kilometer peninsula on the coast of Estonia. Holding this insignificant piece of moorland becomes a matter of life and death.
Hitler issued the order which we had to deliver personally to all the soldiers. I will hear of no one getting off this island except to go to Siberia. We had to tell the soldiers. It was a supreme, personal command.
None of the 10,000 soldiers has a hope of leaving the battlefield in one piece. The Red Army continually replenishes its forces with fresh troops. It continues its advance. The German troops defending the peninsula, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, have little left to offer but their lives. Men like Private Kurt Vetter.
Death is around you every day. You ask yourself, how long are you going to stick this out? We knew one thing for sure. As an ordinary frontline soldier, you'll never get out in one piece. There'll come a time when you get yours. If you're lucky, you'll get a wound that'll send you home. And if you're unlucky, your body will be ripped up, or your legs will be ripped up. We all knew that.
On October the 30th, 1944, Corporal August Müller writes home.
My dear wife and daughter, no one believes we're ever going to give up this little piece of island. The ground is soaked with a huge amount of blood. The Russians are losing many, many men here. There are just 3 men left from our original signals unit. Everyone else is dead or wounded. The war makes tough demands on us.
Then we went into the forest, and there was firing, and my friend was hit. I shook him. I said, "Bernhard, Bernhard, what's happened to you?" He didn't answer. After a while, we got the order to withdraw. What should I do? I ran and left him there, alone. That experience kept shaking me awake at night. Leaving your own friend lying there because you have to save your own life.
Air Force General Flugbeil decorates valiant soldiers on Swarbe.
The deaths of thousands of soldiers become the material for a heroic epic. In mid-November, General Ferdinand Schöner, the Army Group commander, personally visits Swarbe to encourage the soldiers to hold out.
Kam dann auf den Regimentsgefechtsstand und natürlich haben wir.
He arrived at the regimental command post, and naturally we told him we had fewer and fewer able-bodied soldiers every day. Of course, he would have got the message that the peninsula couldn't be held. But that message wasn't enough. Not when the Führer had personally ordered us to hold out to the last man.
In November, August Müller writes,
"If only this war could end. But we're going to have to wait a long time for that. I've been lying in a foxhole all day. They've made this place into a fortress. I expect we're going to die here like dogs."
It came down to this. We said, we have to make sure we get wounded and get off the island that way. Then we drew straws. Whoever got the long one had to do the shooting. The one who got the short one could stick out his leg. I drew the long straw. My mate stood up against a tree about 10 meters away. I loaded my machine pistol and fired. He fell over and started to moan. I said, "Cheer up, you're going home." 4 of us carried him in a tarpaulin to the nearest first aid station and more or less handed him over.
Only the wounded have a chance to get out. After 6 weeks of bitter fighting, 4,000 German soldiers are dead or missing.
This is how you could sum up the fighting on Swarbe. Completely pointless, militarily unjustifiable, politically insane.
The defenders are at last given permission to withdraw. One man will get the credit for their sacrifice. The Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Center, Ferdinand Schöner.
Schöner was a real last-stand general. If we heard he was coming, then everyone who could, just disappeared. They weren't there. Because if he got hold of you, he could quite easily say, "You're not needed here, we need you on the front line." Then you were sent off to one of the divisions.
Even now, Schörner orders the last able-bodied soldiers to defend the remaining areas, regardless of losses and under massive pressure from the enemy and their own side.
They sent in young, barely trained troops and put them in the front lines. 3 days later, their morale was shot through. They were such young people. They couldn't take it anymore, and they ran. That's a very natural reaction. I found it inhumane that some of them were court-martialed. They really couldn't help it.
The idea is that fear for their lives will boost their fighting spirit.
Wir waren auf dem Weg zur Front und plötzlich erschien.
We were on our way to the front, and suddenly Schörner appeared from the opposite direction. We had pitched camp a little off to one side and saw a soldier walking back from the front on his own.
Einzelner Lanzer von Richtung Front nach rückwärts ging.
Schörner immediately went over to him. There was a short conversation, and then Schörner gave one of his people an order. I couldn't hear what he said, and he seemed to pass it on to someone else. And he walked the soldier over to the ditch beside the road and shot him.
An estimated 30,000 death sentences were passed by the military courts of the Wehrmacht. Roughly 20,000 were carried out, most of them in the last year of the war. Mostly on the Eastern Front.
Schörner was always visiting the front. We can see that from his orders. I have seen such and such soldiers at such and such a place and have made sure they were either sent back to the front or were put before a summary court-martial. That's how it was, and that's what impressed Hitler. Schörner wasn't the kind of general to sit behind a map. He went up to the front line and looked after everything.
This gung-ho general represents Hitler's ideal National Socialist warrior. His attitude and his fanaticism count for more than military tradition. After his early years in the elite mountain troops of the old Reichswehr, Schörner rose particularly fast in the Third Reich and conformed to the new way of thinking. Hitler appreciates the fact that he carries out ideologically inspired orders without a second thought.
Schörner always came back from meetings with Hitler, radiating optimism. And every now and then, he would come out with, "The Führer wants me to," or "The Führer expects us to hold the front," or "The Führer expects us to straighten out the front." It's statements like that that make me think he was a political soldier.
The political soldier is the perfect embodiment of Nazi ideology. Since 1944, Wehrmacht soldiers have received more and more political education. Schörner has been specially entrusted with the task of educating his troops politically.
Hitler has long wanted to create a new type of soldier. As the war continues, he's more and more successful in imbuing the troops with the Nazi spirit. There's no other way to explain how they lasted so long. German soldiers held out longer, and that meant the dying went on longer too.
The younger soldiers especially remain under the Führer's spell until the end. For most of them, holding out to the very end is a matter of honor. They're obeying orders, but they also feel a broader allegiance to Hitler and the Reich, and the need to save it from destruction. At the beginning of 1945, Schörner is recalled from Kurland. The king of the last stand is urgently needed at other crisis points. The huge Soviet offensive in the spring of 1945 stretches all the way to Silesia. Outnumbering the Germans by up to 15 to 1, they drive the shattered Wehrmacht units before them.
It really was a chaotic retreat. No other way to describe it. A terrible retreat. We just wanted to get out, to the west. It all ended in Lower Silesia. They had interception officers there. Schörner had put them there to intercept the soldiers, to stop the crazy retreat and firm up the lines.
The soldiers form a defensive belt along a broad front, with some success. The propaganda machine works overtime to build confidence.
Well, lads, you've built yourselves a great villa here.
You can say that again.
And are the Russians leaving you alone here?
Most of the time it's okay. They're more scared than we are.
Newsreels from Fantasyland. Not surprisingly, they were never shown.
And the men know that here they're defending German soil.
Yes, everyone understands that we have to hold on here and can't withdraw a single step.
Captain, do you think that the Russians will have a tough time of it here?
They certainly will.
The Prussian officer of the old school was like a father to his soldiers. He made sure they had as few casualties as possible. He took care of his soldiers, and so on. And the Nazis did the exact opposite. They used people, not me, as cannon fodder, and said we have to hold on. The usual stand firm orders from Hitler. The city will be held to the last man. That was contrary to everything Prussian.
Every effort is futile. In order to disguise that fact, any tiny counter-offensive becomes a turning point in the war.
The liberation of the city of Lauban. At the beginning of March, German troops assemble for a counterattack on the town.
As soon as Schörner's troops have taken Lauban, the town receives a visit from Joseph Goebbels, here to spread the word that victory is imminent. With Hitler in hiding, his propaganda minister is the Reich's only mouthpiece.
At the town square in Lauban, Dr. Goebbels is greeted by the Army Group Commander, General Schörner. A combat unit of the Führer's Grenadier Division marches past.
What they were presenting as fighting troops were just old people forced to join the Volkssturm and children wearing helmets 3 sizes too big for them. No, it wasn't a very pretty picture. We had the feeling that they were just putting on a show.
On the market square, Goebbels lavishly praises Schörner's methods for raising morale. He's particularly impressed that the field marshal simply hangs deserters from the nearest tree.
I believe that wherever our soldiers move on to the offensive on the Eastern Front, no mercy will be expected and none given. And I believe more strongly now than I've ever believed in anything in my whole life that we will one day raise the flag of victory.
Wishful thinking aside, German troops are retreating on every front. In the west, the Allies have crossed the Rhine. They're advancing towards the industrial center of the Ruhr Valley. By the beginning of April, they've surrounded the Reich's arms manufacturing centers on the Rhine and Ruhr. To mount the defense of the Ruhr pocket, Hitler can call on a loyal army group commander, someone to whom he can trust the toughest missions. Field Marshal Model is respected by his soldiers as well.
Model was a man who spent an incredible amount of time actually at the front, not the kind of man who led from the back, who sat with his maps. Instead, he went to wherever he believed his appearance might do some good.
Model is everywhere. His soldiers know it. The Field Marshal steps in wherever it seems necessary.
They used to say Model modelled it back together again, and several times he managed to stop the retreat of an entire army, and later a whole army front, first in the east and then in the west.
Model would defend his point of view with great confidence, even at Hitler's headquarters. No other general criticized Hitler so openly and so often, but only on military matters.
He did not permit criticism of Hitler. Thus, he didn't criticize Hitler as such, but he fought for additional troops, or weapons, or gasoline. And he did that relentlessly, so that it frequently came to screaming matches between Hitler and Model. But Hitler probably didn't hold it against him.
I believe that man can do it, Hitler once said. But I wouldn't like to serve under him.
He wasn't a politician at all. He was strictly a military man and thought only in military terms. They would hold that against him later, and rightly so, considering the high positions he held.
Model issues fiery calls to combat from inside the Ruhr pocket, without the slightest political insight.
A man who no longer believes in victory cannot fight with the necessary toughness and contempt for death.
But by now, his forces in the Ruhr Valley are a motley mix of Home Guard, veterans, and raw recruits. Lothar Esther is a 19-year-old officer cadet.
It was our first engagement. The Russian tanks came towards us, and we were in our foxholes, in twos, each of us with an anti-tank rocket launcher. We got the order to let the first tanks through until they reached the last foxhole. We obeyed at first until one of us probably got nervous and opened fire. When that happened, the tanks which were still there did something I'd never seen before. They drove straight for the foxhole in which the German soldiers lay, made a 360-degree turn on top of the foxhole, and drove away, leaving behind the grave of the two soldiers.
All this sacrifice is in vain. US forces keep tightening the noose. They don't even have to try very hard anymore. The defenders are cut off from their supplies. Model sends his adjutant on an important mission.
Then Model said goodbye to me, and I believe I saw a tear in his eye. He gave me a letter for his wife, and I sensed it was his farewell letter. I couldn't imagine Model ever becoming a prisoner.
Model sends his messenger to Berlin so that Hitler will be in no doubt exactly how bad the situation has become in the Ruhr pocket.
When Hitler came into the room, I said that we couldn't hold out more than one more day, because we'd run out of gasoline and ammunition, and the soldiers' morale had hit rock bottom. And I said the last spark of resistance in the Ruhr pocket is Field Marshal Model himself. But he can't give his troops any orders, because there was nothing more to order.
Seinen Truppen Befehle zu geben. Es gibt nichts mehr zu befehlen.
And then Hitler said, yes, Model. He was my best field marshal.
Thus, the conscientious general has already been written off, without even knowing it. Nevertheless, he sticks to his task.
Fight to the last and die with a weapon in our hand. I invite each of you to follow me.
Model still refuses to consider surrendering. His soldiers are left without leadership. As the enemy advance on German soil continues, every member of the Wehrmacht now faces the same dilemma. In the ancient city of Gotha in eastern Germany, so far untouched by the war, Josef Ritter von Gardolla is summoned from his command post in Castle Friedenstein. He's ordered to prepare the defense of the town.
With a simple handshake, Gardolla committed himself to defend Gotha to the last man, the last drop of blood. So, of course, they made thorough preparations. Trenches were dug, 16-year-olds were called up. Even the wounded in the field hospital were told that whoever could walk would be expected to fight.
By the beginning of April, the Americans are a few kilometers from Gotha. In his command bunker, it's time for Gardolla, an Austrian by birth, to show his true colors.
He knew he didn't have enough troops to defend the city, and he expected that casualties would be high. He wanted to spare human lives.
Gardolla persuades other representatives of the city to back his plan. He intends to do something unprecedented for a Wehrmacht officer. He will drive in person from the castle to the American lines to offer them the peaceful surrender of the city. But on the way, an anti-aircraft unit stops him. He's declared a traitor and reduced to the ranks. He's then transported to Weimar. The next day, a summary court-martial sentences him to death by firing squad. Within hours, the sentence is carried out. Gardolla is one of very few officers who put conscience before duty, and yet even today he remains largely unknown. And he achieved his aim. Gotha remained unscathed. On the day of his death, the US Army entered the city without firing a single shot. Gardolla had ordered the Wehrmacht to pull out and had hung out white flags. The Americans could advance unopposed. Most German generals can't appreciate the good sense of Gardolla's actions until they themselves have nothing more to lose. Like the generals in Trent Park in England, where they're held as prisoners of war in the spring of 1945.
I always used to think it was wrong to surrender. It would cause a rift in the nation that could have disastrous consequences. But now it has to end. It's simply madness.
We will not fall. any nation can lose a war. Because it was stupidly led, put in an impossible position by the politicians. But it cannot lose a war if it fights properly to the end.
It's suicide. It's a collective suicide of a nation. Something history has never before seen.
At his last headquarters, an estate near Düsseldorf. Out of touch with the reality of the situation in the Ruhr pocket, Model rejects every call for surrender. He lets his soldiers decide for themselves if they want to continue fighting. In mid-April, he resigns his post and hides with a few of his most loyal followers in a forest near Duisburg.
On April the 20th, Hitler's birthday, Goebbels made a speech that was downright absurd.
The Führer will follow his path to the very end, where there awaits not the destruction of his people, but a new, happier beginning, a golden age of German culture, the like of which has never been seen before.
I was right beside him, and he said, "I have sacrificed my life for these bastards." As long as he was giving orders from morning to night, he could brush it all aside, saying, "That's politics. Don't get involved in that. Do your duty." But now that he'd spent 24 hours in a forest without his field marshal's baton, sitting around with just 5 people, eaten alive by mosquitoes, he finally realized the absurdity of it all. Then he said to me, "Bear, you can't expect me, a field marshal accountable for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people or more, who had to accept responsibility for that and did, to walk out of this forest with his hands up and say, 'Here I am, Field Marshal Model.'"
The next day, tortured by the idea that he's served a false god, the now powerless general accepts the consequences and escapes his responsibilities.
If the generals had said, "Enough is enough," Hitler could have done anything and it wouldn't have worked. If the generals had said, "Enough is enough," it would have been over, but they didn't. They soldiered on to the very end.
Especially on the Eastern Front. At his command post, a Czech resort hotel near Königgrätz, Field Marshal Schöner celebrates the Führer's birthday in his own way.
On Hitler's birthday, the entire staff was summoned, and there was Schöner, still spouting fiery words glorifying Hitler. The Führer has entrusted us with a mission, and it is our duty not to disappoint him, but to live up to his trust.
True to his words, Schöner's men fight on, even after Hitler's death, when soldiers elsewhere gradually started to come to their senses. At the end of the war, this commander who drove his people to hold out to the very last moment turned out to be remarkably adaptable.
Seeing Schöner that morning wearing a civilian suit was something of a shock. I couldn't make sense of it. He asked me to drive with him to the airfield. When we reached the airfield, there was only one plane there, and we said goodbye in a rather businesslike fashion.
Hoping to land in American captivity, Schöner heads west on May the 9th, abandoning his army to an uncertain fate. But he has miscalculated. The Americans sent him back to the Soviets as a prisoner. He returns home in 1955, In West Germany, he's prosecuted for his wartime record, but he's unrepentant.
The one bond that held Army Group Center together to the last day of the war was the confidence my soldiers had in me and the boundless trust I had in my soldiers.
Between January and May 1945, 1.2 million German soldiers have died. The enemy's losses also run into millions. The Wehrmacht had proved to be the deadliest tool any dictator had ever had at his disposal, until its own destruction.
From a military or political point of view, they should have stopped much earlier. The whole strategy, if you want to call it that, amounted to nothing more than self-destruction. You either win or you die.
The death, destruction, and misery that this army brought on the world finally rebounded on it. The wounds still hurt today.
And there'll be more frontline programs tomorrow afternoon from 4 to 6. Next today, analysis of one of the most devastating bloodbaths of World War II, the Great Battle for Stalingrad in Battlefield Detectives, here on the History Channel.